Let's talk about the Data Audit node, and specifically we're going to talk about the Quality tab of the Data Audit node. The Data Audit node is located in the Output palette. This node allows you to take a first look at your data, and it includes summary statistics and graphs, as well as information on outliers, missing data, and extreme scores. As an example, here we have a representation of the Quality tab of the Data Audit node. You can see that we see the names of each one of the different fields, their level of measurement, the number of outliers and extreme scores that they have, and you can also take action to remedy these outliers and extreme scores. You can also specify if you want to impute any missing values and what method you want to use to impute those missing values. And then you get a representation of how much complete and missing data you have. Let's go through an example of how to use the Data Audit node so that it could help us deal with missing values and with outliers. So we're going to go down to the Output palette and we're going to connect the Data Audit node to our source node. We're going to edit the Data Audit node. We're going to move over to the Quality tab and we're going to look at the options that we have here. So in terms of missing values, the default is that we're going to count the number of records with valid values. So we're going to get the number of valid values that we have for each one of our different fields. We're then also going to get a breakdown of the records that have invalid values. So we'll see the different types of invalid values that we have. You'll see that we'll have null values and we'll have blank values, etc. In terms of how we're going to handle outliers and extreme cases, you can specify that you could use either the standard deviation from the mean or the inner quartile range. Either option is a good option to use. The standard deviation from the mean is the default option, and in terms of how you're going to interpret that information, anytime that you have a case that's more than 3 standard deviations away from the mean, it's going to be classified as an outlier. Anytime you have a case that's more than 5 standard deviations away from the mean, it's going to be classified as an extreme case. Now you can certainly change these values if you want, but you have to remember these definitions because they are going to come back in terms of how we end up handling some of these outliers and extreme values. So we'll just click on Run. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to move over to the Quality tab. Now the Quality tab gives us some information in terms of each one of these different variables. So you can see the name of each one of these different fields, you can see their level of measurement, you can see the number of outliers that are associated with each one of these different fields. For example, the variable age has 27 outliers. So these are 27 cases that were more than 3 standard deviations away from the mean. We can also see that for the variable age, we have 0 cases that were extreme cases. So even though we have 27 outliers, we do not have any cases that were more than 5 standard deviations away from the mean, because in this case, that's our definition of an extreme value. Now, if we wanted to handle some of these outliers or extreme cases, we have this action column. Okay, the action column allows us to perform some kind of action on any outliers or extreme values that we happen to have. So let's look at some of the options that we have here. So in terms of the field age, we're just going to click on the cell there. The default is set to none, meaning that we're not going to make any kind of change. The next option that we have is that we can coerce these values, these outliers and extreme cases, so that they become the upper and lower bounds of that distribution. So basically what coerce does is it takes any values that are more than, in this case, 3 standard deviations away from the mean, and it makes them either the upper end or the lower end of the distribution, depending on whether if the value itself was higher than the upper end or lower than the lower end. You also have the discard option. The discard option basically gets rid of that record altogether. The nullify option, what that does is it takes any outliers or extreme cases and it just nullifies them, so as if you didn't have any information there. You also have the option to just coerce the outliers and discard the extremes, or coerce the outliers and nullify the extremes as well. In our case, we're just going to use coerce. So we're going to use coerce. We're going to select that field. We're only going to make the change for only one field here. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to go up to the Generate menu, and we're going to choose this option for outlier and extreme cases. We're going to create a supernode. We certainly could have selected more than one case, but we're only going to do that here, and we're going to only select one field. We'll select that. In terms of the supernode that we're going to create, we could create it for all of the fields or just the ones that we've selected. We'll select the only selected fields option, and we'll just click OK. At this point, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what was created. We have our supernode here. I'm just going to connect the source node over to the supernode, and I'm going to edit the supernode so we can take a look at what was done. So I'm just going to edit this node here, and you can see that we ended up using a filler node. We took the variable age, and what was done was that we always ended up replacing any time the field age had a value less than 11.6 approximately. Okay, and then it replaced it with the value of 11.6. Now, where did we get this value of 11.6? Well, that's the value that's 3 standard deviations below the mean. We can then also see that if the variable age had a value greater than 111, then we ended up replacing any of those values that were greater than 111 with a value of 111. And again, where did we get that value? That's because that value is 3 standard deviations above the mean. So that's where these values came into play. Now, if we wanted to change these values to something a little more reasonable, for example, maybe we know, for example, that everyone in the sample, they were all adults. So maybe the minimum age should be actually 18. Maybe we also know, for example, that no one in the sample was over the age of 99. We certainly could change that here if we wanted to as well. But again, these numbers were calculated based on the defaults that we had set up, which were in this case that any outliers were any cases that were more than 3 standard deviations away from the mean. So we'll click OK. And we're going to get out of the supernode. So that's an example of one way in which you can handle outliers or extreme cases. Let's take a look at what else we found with the data audit node. So in terms of the data audit node, for example, we can see that it also helps us handle missing information. So it gives us some information right off the bat. In terms of the percent of complete fields, we see that about 31% of the fields had complete data. We see that there are no records that had complete information across all of the fields. Okay, so that gives us some important information there as well. In terms of missing values, we can see, for example, that this first case, I'm just going to expand the size of the window here a little bit. We can see that this first case, the case state, had 100% complete data. Okay, whereas domain had 97% complete data, and so on. You can also see the number of valid records for each one of these fields as well. And then you can see the number of null values, empty strings, white space, and blank values that we have there at the end. So you get a breakdown of all the different types of missing data if you did happen to have missing data on any one of these different fields. Now, in terms of what kind of actions we can take when it comes to missing data, well, one thing that we could do, for example, is we certainly could sort our data based on completeness, for example. If we wanted to then highlight, any of the cases that had a very small amount of complete data, let's say any cases that had 10% complete data or less, we could certainly highlight that. And then we can go up to the Generate menu. And at this point, what we could do is we can click on Missing Values Filter Node. And then what this would allow us to do is that, in this case, we have to specify whether we want the mode to be include or exclude. But if we decide to select selected fields, we want to exclude these fields that have been selected. So that would basically allow us to filter out any of the fields that we've selected in this case because they have too much missing data. Or we could have selected all of the fields that we wanted to keep, and we could have chosen the option to include as well. Another option that we could have done is, instead of selecting anything, we could have just actually have chosen fields that have a quality percentage higher than a certain percentage. So any field that had higher than 70% complete, for example, we could have chosen to include them. Or we could have chosen to exclude any field that had a percentage of higher quality less than 70% or 50% or whatever other percentage we wanted to use. So if we wanted to use something like this, I'll just click on OK. And we're going to exclude these fields. And now I'm just going to minimize what we have here. And now what we have is we have a filter node. And if I connect my source node over to this filter node and I edit the filter node, you can see that we filtered out 14 fields. So I'm just going to cancel out here. I'm going to go back and take a look at the data audit node, take a look at what we had done here. Now, let's say, for example, we wanted to try out a different option. We can go up to the Generate menu, and we can also click on Missing Value Select node. Now, in terms of what we can do here we're basically going to generate a select node for us automatically so that we can select a record when it is either valid or invalid. Invalid would be that it would have missing information. We could look for these invalid values in all of the fields that we had selected, or fields that have a certain percentage of complete data. And we can decide to consider a record invalid if it has a missing value in any of the above fields or all of the above fields. So this can certainly allow you to create a lot of different options in terms of who you end up selecting so that you can use in a particular series of analyses. We're not going to use this one here, but you can see, all the possibilities that you have there. So as an example of something that we could do, we could just select these first few variables, and we just selected some variables here. We can go up to the Generate menu, and then we can click on Missing Value Select node. And in this case, we're going to work with the fields that we've selected in this table. We're going to select all of the valid cases. So let's say, for example, we only wanted to work when we happen to have valid data. And we're going to consider a record invalid if it has any invalid value found in any of these above fields. Okay? So we're going to go with that option. So here we'll click OK, we'll close out of this window. And the basic idea here now is that we've created a select node that only has complete data for those fields that we just had selected. So we'll edit the select node, and here basically what this is telling us now is that we're discarding any cases that have missing information on all of those fields that we had just selected. So that's an example of how you could use the select node option so that you can either select certain fields or discard certain fields as well. Now let's take a look at another way in which you can handle missing information. Let's say, for example, we want to take a look at the field income. Okay, notice that the field income, and this is the field, we have 77% complete data. We see that we have a good amount of null values. Well, let's take a look at this field. I'm going to go back over to the Audit tab. And we're just going to double click on the field income. We want to take a look at its distribution. Now you can see what the distribution looks like. This income field has values that range from 1 through 7. Okay? Now, let's say that instead of just identifying who has missing data, let's say we wanted to impute missing values. Well, we could certainly do that within the data audit node. So we've taken a look at what the distribution looks like for this field. I'm going to close out of this window. We see the values range from 1 through 7. I'm going to go back over to the Quality tab. Now I'm going to go to the field income, and in terms of imputing missing values, I'm going to say that instead of never imputing any missing values, I'm going to impute missing values whenever we happen to have null values. And I'm choosing null values because that's the only type of missing information we happen to have. Now, in terms of what method I want to use to impute the missing values, there are several options. We'll take a look at these in a minute. What we're going to do here, though, is we're going to click on Specify so we can see some additional options. So I'm going to impute missing values whenever I have null values. I could use the fixed value option, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose random. And so we already saw what the distribution looked like for that field. We saw that it wasn't a normal distribution, it was a uniform distribution. So I'm going to choose uniform. So what this is going to do is it's going to impute a random value where we know that those random values are going to go somewhere between the values of 1 through 7. Because that's what the distribution looked like, and so we basically are just going to create new values that fall within that particular distribution of what we were looking at for that particular variable. So I'm just going to click OK. So that's one way to impute missing values. Let's take a look at another variable. Here we happen to have the field num children, number of children. So let's take a look at the distribution of that field. So if I look at the field num children, I'm just going to double click on that field. We see that the values range from 1 through 7, but you can see that this is certainly not a normal distribution. It's not a uniform distribution at all. Most people seem to have just a few number of kids. We're talking about 1 and 2, the most typical values. But strangely enough, there are no values of 0. Well, that's because the way this question was worded was this question was only asked of those people that specified that they had kids. So those people that had missing data on this variable, that's because they weren't asked this question because they had specified that they did not have any children. So we'll close out of this window, and so whenever we happen to have missing values for this variable number of kids, what we're going to do is we're going to specify that the number of kids, those people that have missing information, that's because they had no children. So they had a value of 0. So we're going to change the value for impute missing from never over to null values. We're going to use the fix method, but we want to specify the exact value that we want to use, so I'm going to click on specify. I'm going to choose fixed, and instead of choosing the mid-range of the distribution, I could choose the mean, which is the value of 2, but instead I'm going to use a constant, and the constant is going to be 0. And that's the default that we have there as the constant. So I'm just going to click OK. So anybody that happened to have missing information on number of kids, now that missing value is going to be replaced by a 0. And let's try out one final option. I'm going to go back over to the Audit tab. And I'm going to take a look at the distribution of this field wealth. We see the field wealth has a distribution that ranges from values from 0 to 9. It has a mean of 5 and a standard deviation of 3. You can see what the distribution looks like. Certainly not a normal distribution, certainly not a uniform distribution either. And so I'm going to specify missing values for this variable in a different way. I'm going to close out of this window, and I'm going to go over to the Quality tab. Now here what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the field wealth, and I'm going to specify that I do want to replace their missing values. They only happen to have null values again, so I'm going to choose null values. And this time I'm going to, I'm not going to use fix, or I'm not going to use random. Notice that there are two other options. We could use expression or algorithm. Let's click on specify and take a look at both of those. So if I click on expression, here I basically am going to write in my own equation. So I can click on the expression builder and I can create my own expression however I wish. You know, I can have it be an expression that's made up out of numeric values, out of functions, out of fields that are in the data set as well. Now I'm not going to use that here. I'm going to use the last option, so I'll cancel out of here. And I'm not going to use an expression, but I'm going to use an algorithm. Now there's only one algorithm that's available, and that's the cart algorithm. So basically what's going to happen here is I'm going to use the field wealth. I'm going to use that as my outcome field, my target field. And I'm going to predict whenever I have missing values based on all of the other fields that I have in the data set. And I'm going to use the cart model to make those predictions. So I'll click OK. So those are the 3 new fields that I'm going to impute missing values for. I'm going to highlight them. So I've selected wealth, I've selected income, and the number of children. Okay, so 3 different ways of imputing missing values. I'm going to go up to the Generate menu. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to select Missing Values Supernode. I'll select that. I'm not going to do this for all of the fields. I'm only going to do it for those fields that I've selected. I'm going to base it off of 10% of the sample, okay, to make my adjustments. That's fine. We can certainly change that if we wanted to. I'll click OK. And now I'm just going to close out of this window. You can see that the model is being built at the moment. So notice that our model was just built. And so now I'm going to connect our source node over to our supernode. And let's take a look at what's going on in the supernode. So here we have the cart model. I'm just going to edit that model. Let's take a look at what was built. Here are the different fields in terms of their predictor importance, in terms of predicting our field wealth 1. We can click on the Viewer tab, and you can see the number of cases that we have here. You can see that domain was the first field in which we ended up using to make our predictions, and then you can see that we have some other fields underneath that. So this allowed us to make our predictions for whenever we happen to have missing information for the field wealth 1. So we'll close out of this window. And now let's take a look at some of the modifications that were made. We're going to take a look at this filler node. This is for the field number of children, and you can see that whenever we had a null value, we just replaced it with the value of 0, and that's what we had said. We were going to replace any missing values with a value of 0, meaning that these people did not have kids. Let's take a look at what was done with the filler node for the field income. With the field income, what we ended up doing was we basically wanted to impute random values for whenever we had missing information for the field income. So we took the value of 1 and then plus a random value that could have ranged from 1 through 6. So that ensures that the new values that we have for this field are always going to be values from 1 through 7. Click OK. And then let's edit the filter node for the field wealth 1. And here we took the field wealth 1, we replaced any null values with the predictions. And here we have the prediction that we had made. So we'll click OK. And then we have a filter node here, and the filter node allowed us to filter out the prediction field that we had created. So we'll just click OK now. And we're going to zoom out of the supernode. So that's the way we ended up handling missing values, so that we can impute missing values for any cases that we happen to have missing information. And in addition, not only were we able to do this directly within the data audit node, but we also got a sense of how much missing information we had. So now we can go back over to the type node, for example, and we can make some adjustments so that we don't have as much missing data.